teaching the course. Part of it's based on being involved in the whole College Board process of scoring essays and seeing what common mistakes that students make. But part of this is enhanced also by having a daughter who's in high school and a son who's in 8th grade, and watching how they study and seeing the ways that are effective and efficient and ways that I think are somewhat counterproductive. So my son tends to overdo things, to like read his social studies book and read like 8 pages and take 5 pages of notes, and I'm like, Kyle, do you think that's really the most efficient way to do it? So I know AP Euro is a hard class. I know for a lot of people it's their hardest class, but I don't really get any kind of a charge out of students going, I spent 2 hours reading 8 pages of reading last night. I don't really want you to say that, because if that's what you're doing, you're not really making effective use of your time. If you haven't, those of you who know me haven't gotten, I'm about efficiency. I like to get the most bang for my buck. I don't want to spend hours and hours doing something that has a very low payoff. So reading your textbook is obviously, for the first thing that you do outside of class, is really the essential part of making sure that you understand the material of the course. Clearly, you could rely, if you wanted to, on just what was going on in class, but I think there'd still be something lacking. So for many students, their degree of success is related to what they get out of reading the textbook. And a lot of this is true for later on. So when you go to college, and instead of reading 7 or 8 pages a night, you're going to have to read 50 pages a night in your book. You want to make sure that you actually have comprehension of what you're reading. And the problem that a lot of students have when they approach, especially the study of history, because the way it's taught often at the junior high level and sometimes even at the freshman level, is history is not just a bunch of facts. So if you're reading your textbook just to gain facts, you are making the first mistake, and it's going to bog you down into a morass of minutia. And what you need to do is create an intellectual framework that you impose upon the reading. You are asking yourself analytical questions, and you are seeking the answers to those questions as you read. Yes, you want to be able to retain content and material and people and dates and events and treaties and wars and famous works of art and intellectual treatises, but you need to be able to connect them to something meaningful. Otherwise, it'll just be like you go into the ocean and a tide of waters is crashing over you, and it might be sort of an enjoyable experience, but you're not going to retain anything from it when it comes to like the study of history. Okay? So this is basically about how you can approach the reading of the textbook and get more out of it. It does require a little bit of time up front and a little bit of time at the end when you're done reading. But I think overall, when you practice a technique like this, and you know, this is not, I'm not inventing anything new here. This is like common sense stuff that's been taught by, you know, people who are encouraging students for years and years and years. But if you practice this technique, it'll get easier as you go along. Okay? So the average reading load in a text reading, I think, if you know, depending, it doesn't really matter which teacher you have, it's probably about 7 to 10 pages an evening. And I don't know, part of it depends on how fast of a reader you are. But if it's taking you 2 hours to read 7 to 10 pages, there's a problem somewhere. And I think it goes beyond just the fact that you may or may not be a slow reader. So I would say 30 to 50 minutes is about what you want to be spending on a reading. And if you start practicing some of these techniques, you can probably see if you can shorten that a little bit. Not below 30 minutes necessarily, but you know, going from an hour, hour and a half to maybe 45 minutes would be your goal. So you're going to really focus on building your understanding versus just a bunch of facts. So your understanding is asking the right question. So you got to think about, what am I trying to accomplish as I approach this particular reading? So you might think about how you would look at the chapter heading of that particular section of the textbook and say, okay, what do I want to know when I'm done reading this section? And so maybe you should stop after that section and pause for 30 seconds and say, okay, what was this section about? What was the main point of this section? What were the supporting points? What seems to be the most important example or people or events that I want to retain from this section of the book? So you are really bringing a structure to it, which is why I think highlighting, and I've told some of my students this before, I am not a big fan of highlighting. So that's what this handout is for you to look at it as an example of a different way of approaching the textbook. So this is from a textbook that we used to use, we no longer use. It's from a topic that we haven't studied yet, but we will be studying probably near the end of the first semester, and that's the Industrial Revolution. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in detail, but I have not highlighted this section of the textbook. Instead, what I did is I did do some underlining, and I did make some annotations. I did make some margin notes. I asked myself some questions, and I also generated an outline at the end, which is basically what this is here on the first page. So obsessive highlighting is not constructing an analytical framework. It's basically, in my mind, just massaging a piece of paper with your highlighter. And it's mostly done in a sense of like, oh, I don't want to miss anything. So it's that kind of guilty conscience. But that's not really the part of your brain that learns. That's the part of your brain that interferes often with learning. Okay, so there's a method called SQ3R, so I'm adapting it to SQ2RA. But basically, the first thing you want to do before you start reading, and I have to do this too, and I've taught the course for 18 years. I don't just flip the book open and start reading. If it's a reading, it's like pages 425 to 433. I don't just open the book and start reading. I look at what's the chapter heading. Before I read any book, even a book that I'm enjoying, like a nonfiction book, I read the introduction, I read the preface. I want to know why the author wrote the book. I want to know what their thesis is. I want to look at the table of contents. I want to know where I'm going before I embark on that journey. Maybe that's just my personality, but when it comes to nonfiction, I think that's important. Maybe for fiction, you just want to, start from scratch and just get yourself involved in the story. But for nonfiction, I think you need to have a roadmap of where is this chapter going? Where is this section going? So survey for a minute and look at the chapter heading before you begin reading. And then ask yourself, these are just generic analytical questions that can be adapted to any topic at any chronological time period. Okay, what caused this event? What other developments are going on during the same period that I could connect this to, where I could find some sense of like, oh yeah, now I think I understand the period. I understand why Baroque art is associated with the Catholic Counter-Reformation or with absolutism. I get how those two things are related. They're related in this following way. So being able to identify themes and key concepts, and to be able to think chronologically, that's one of the major reasons why students do poorly on essay questions on the national exam. Okay, a couple of years ago, last year wasn't so bad, but in 2009, we had 3 questions that had average scores below 2.5 on a 9-point scale, 0 to 9. And that's because students chose, they knew something about the question, they just chose the wrong material because it wasn't relevant to the question. Like one of the questions about anti-Semitism in the 19th century. So a lot of them wrote about the Nazis and Hitler and World War II. It's like, well, that's nice. You knew a lot about Hitler and the Nazis and the Nuremberg laws and Kristallnacht, but unfortunately the question's about the 19th century, so you're not able to make the most out of what you knew because you were answering the wrong question. Okay? So, think about what resulted. So you're thinking in terms of cause and effect. But be able to define movement. If you're dealing with, for example, an intellectual movement, like Romanticism, you should be able to define it in specific terms, using real, meaningful, informative terminology, and not simply just rephrasing some vague generalization. Romanticism was about new ideas, and that doesn't really tell us much about what Romanticism is about. What Romanticism is about? Intuition and emphasizing the importance of emotions, or nature, or national histories, or the unique individual, or the person who may not fit in with the mainstream, or bohemian artist. So try to come up with something that's useful as a definition. And, I don't know, I provide reading guides for my students and their study guide questions. I would look at these before you even start reading. So it gives you an idea of what you should be looking for. So if you approach a reading and you're not really looking for something, then you started off on the wrong foot. If you're just like, oh, let's see what happens when I start reading, let's see what facts stick. I mean, I hate to use this analogy, but there's a theory of education called the crap on the wall theory. I could use other words, but so if you just throw enough crap on the wall, okay, hopefully some of it will stick. It's not a very beautiful analogy, but that's what you're doing. If you don't approach the reading with a sense of creating an analytical framework, you're just going with the crap on the wall theory. It's like, if I just read enough facts, maybe some of the facts will stick on me, and that's not really what you want to do. You want to create the structure. Sorry for my horrible analogy. All right, then you're going to read, but as you read, you got to obviously focus on what questions you ask yourself and look for those answers. I mean, I hate to bring this up, but it's sort of basic. I mean, I see my kids. My daughter's got her Facebook open, and there's music going on, and there's TV in the background. I was like, how much stimulation do you need while you're reading? I don't know. There is something to be said for once in a while unplugging and just focusing on one thing, seeing if you can concentrate your attention. Maybe your mind would do a better job of constructing that intellectual framework if it wasn't so bombarded by other kinds of influences which had nothing to do with the task at hand. And then I would do some annotate. I would annotate as you go along. Don't get carried away. Whatever's useful. Okay. And then at the end, you might even make a little outline, long enough that it's helpful in reviewing what you just read, but not so long that you go, I'm never going to do this as a regular practice. I mean, if it's not a regular practice, then it's probably too long. So I'm talking like a minute or two. Go back over your annotations, go back over what you just read, and say, okay, what would be a quick outline of figuring out how this particular section of the text was structured. So that's this review part, okay? So if my wife calls me on the phone and says, honey, can you go stop at the store and get eggs, milk, butter, cheese, macaroni and cheese, ice cream? And if I was like, okay, sure. If I don't like immediately review what she just asked me to do and say what those things are, maybe create a mnemonic device, there's no way I'm going to remember all of them. And I get home and I get in trouble, and that's not cool. All right, so I'd rather just like take the time to review, because how long does it take for something to go from your short-term to your long-term memory? I don't know what that is, but it takes some repetition, right? Anybody here feel like there's a disconnect sometimes between their short-term and their long-term memory? You like want to remember something, but it doesn't get stored, because there really are different parts of your brain. Short-term memory can remember a certain amount of data, like, that's why phone numbers are 10 digits. It's about how much you can remember before you commit it to your long-term memory. So then, when you're done reviewing, revisit your notes at the end of the unit or at the end of the, when you're doing a chapter test or a unit test. Go back over what you created. I mean, that's the purpose for you creating. Don't just do it because you feel like you should. Do it because it's actually useful.